Yeah, thanks for coming. Just to give you a bit of an idea, what's coming now, I will talk for about 25 minutes, and then we can have a bit of a discussion and have a smooth transition to the upcoming Rakia workshop. So this is about storytelling in information security, and the question motivating this talk is this. How to make users behave safely. This is a question that many of you may have faced in your lives at one point or the other. And as you know, there are a couple of ways to achieve this. You can explain things to the users. This is successful to a certain point, depending on the user. You can take away their permissions, which is also successful to a certain point, and afterwards it decreases productivity significantly when users come to you because they can't actually do the work they are supposed to do. And finally, this is another possibility which has a detrimental effect upon workplace atmosphere. So there must be a better way, and this way I think is telling stories. A bit about why this works. There is a very good book about storytelling, and it's a neuroscientific background by a scientist called Gottschall. And in his book, he wonders why the human ape, because we are nothing else than that, has evolved a sense of storytelling. It is obvious, I think, in our culture that all cultures at some point or the other have developed this method, and the question is why. It has to fulfill some kind of purpose, because otherwise we would have spent our time differently, like, for example, hunting for food or procreating. So what's the advantage when you are in front of the saber-toothed lion? Right in this moment, of course, there's no advantage, but if you survive and come back to your tribe, then storytelling is the most effective way to share your experiences with others and prevent them from making the same mistakes. So storytelling is a kind of teaching tool way before PowerPoint. So why do we remember the contents of stories better than anything else? The first reason is when you tell a story, it has a certain arc of tension. The tension is rising, and then you reach a climax, and then the tension is decreasing. And with this arc, you can direct your listeners' or viewers' attention to certain points in the story, which, for example, is why most of you will be familiar with this cat that you see there. This is, of course, the cat of James Bond villain Blofeld, and the cat is utterly unimportant in the movies, but it turns up just in a moment when the tension is rising and Bond is confronting the villain. So at this point of high emotional involvement of the viewer, you are very attentive even for rather insignificant details, and you can use this feature of stories to direct others' attention. The second point is that stories organize knowledge much better than if you just spill out some unconnected facts. For example, if you take a medical student and you teach him that if the creatinine value is above a certain point, that's a sign of kidney disease, and chances are that you have to tell him that 4 or 5 times until he remembers this fact, but if you embed it into a story of an individual patient who is developing symptoms and is finally diagnosed with the disease, then not only will this fact stick much better, but all surrounding facts, for example, the symptoms as well. Then the next point is they offer self-reference, which is just a fancy way of saying they answer the question that every student has at some point: what will I ever need this knowledge for? When you tell a story, it's obvious, because stories are designed in a way that the listener will mentally replace the story's protagonist with himself, and so immediately see why the contents of the story are relevant to himself or herself. Yeah, and finally some neuroscience. What you are seeing here is the amygdala. That's a part of the brain that processes emotions, especially fear, but also has a strong connection to how emotions are stored. And you achieve optimal storage of memories when there is a medium amount of emotional involvement. If you have no emotional involvement at all, then the reader or listener will just be bored. And if you have a very, very high involvement, then the reader is in a kind of panic, you could say, and this is also bad for information storage, but a medium amount is just what you want. So let's go back a step and ask this question: what is a story? This has been asked many times before, and as you may know, the ancient Greeks had their own theory about this. They had this arc that I mentioned previously with the rising tension and then achieving a climax, and after that the tension is resolved and then the story ends. Actually, I think today's modern stories work more like this, where you have somehow of an increase in tension, and then there's a first little climax, the first conflict is resolved, there is maybe something funny to lighten the mood, and then the next conflict is coming up until the final climax, and then the resolution is rather short. The main person involved in the story is called the protagonist. I will use that word later so you know. Yeah, some people have made it even more complicated. For example, this anthropologist, he looked at different cultures and found that the myths in different cultures are somehow similar, in that there is a hero who is called to an adventure. He receives some supernatural aid, then he crosses a threshold into the unknown and faces challenges, and then goes through an abyss, the biggest catastrophe, and is transformed and can finally return to the realm of the known. But I think we don't need any of this for our purposes here, so I will stick to this working definition. A story is about humans doing stuff. Humans, of course, don't need to be biologically human. It's enough if they have some human features that allow us to identify with them. And of course, they need to do stuff so we can learn something. The science of storytelling in education and training has also been evaluated by others, of course, and this is from a book written by researchers of the US Army, and they found 4 different types of stories that you can use in education and training. And this is kind of a spectrum. You start with the narrative, that is a story that is optimized for the highest emotional involvement of the listener or viewer, which is equivalent, for example, to a Hollywood movie. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are stories that want the reader or listener, or let's say just the learner, to be actively involved and analyze the story for different outcomes and the optimal course of action. Yeah, as I said, this is a good example of a narrative where some facts are freely interpreted in order to make this a suspenseful story and have emotional arousal in the viewer, and this can be very useful to have the viewer identify with what's happening on the screen and to raise awareness for a certain issue, but it doesn't do much for analysis and for problem solving. It appeals to our emotions and not to the analytical capabilities. Yeah, an example for a case study. Some of you may have heard of Lukas Krankenhaus in Germany, which was attacked by ransomware last year. And this case study has been all through the German media. And this is a typical case study in that it has a defined beginning and a defined end. And you can go through it and think about the decisions that have been made and evaluate them, but you can't in retrospect alter the course of action. And that's different in a scenario. It's more open-ended. You describe a certain situation, and for example, you can say you get to work in the morning and you boot up your computer and this is what you see, and what are your different options, what do you do next, what would maybe not be as advisable. And the problem-based learning is basically similar, only that you have an even less defined situation and more options of handling the whole thing. And this is supposed to teach you to actively analyze the situation and explore, at least in your mind, the different possibilities of solving it. But if you are working with users that are not, that don't have a technical background, you may fare better if you don't actually use stories from information security. You can also take your stories from other fields, and in fact that may be better because you will have a better connection to the world and the imagination of your listeners or readers. I will illustrate this with an example from Star Trek. Many of you may remember the race of the Q from Star Trek: The Next Generation, which aired in the 1980s and 90s. And for those of you who don't remember, it was this race of omnipotent beings who used to greatly get on the nerves of Captain Picard and his crew. And they were from the Q Continuum, which was a place that existed in maybe a different dimension. And in order for the Q and the crew of the Enterprise to interact, sometimes it was necessary for the humans to visit this Q Continuum. But the Q said, you humans can't possibly visit the real place. Your minds would just blow. And so they made up analogies or metaphors. They transferred this continuum into something that was from the daily experience, or at least the imagination of humans. And for example, here, the Q transformed their continuum to make it look like a house in the desert, which is obviously something that any human mind can cope with. Yeah. And as a little excursus to this talk, now it's almost exactly 30 years ago that Q first appeared on screen. So if we want to apply this in a practical manner, the question is, where do we get our stories from? Do we have to make them up ourselves? No. This is of course the classical example of a metaphor that has been wildly successful in the infosec field, the Trojan horse. I think all of you know this. So you can use myths and legends from almost any culture as a source of metaphors. I have looked a bit through the Bible and found this. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers, which certainly refers to firewalls. And I found this. For you say, I am rich, I have prospered, and I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched, pitiable, poor, blind, and naked, which reminded me somehow of Apple users that are so certain that no virus can harm them, for they have a superior operating system. If you want to go at this in a systematic manner, there is an even better source than the Bible. It's the Analogies Project, which is a non-profit project started by a British infosec consultant, Bruce Hellis. And this is a portal where all kinds of metaphors and analogies that you can use for information security are collected. Some of them are from literature and also old fairy tales, for example, and others that I will show you later are from our daily experience. For example, from literature, there is Rapunzel, this fairy tale of the brothers Grimm. Maybe you remember there was this maiden locked in the tower by the evil witch, and she lets down her very long hair to allow her suitor to climb up, and the witch then cheats her and acts as though she was the suitor and climbs up and cuts off her hair and then uses this hair to attract the suitor, whom she then blinds, which teaches us that biometric access control can be fooled. And Rumpelstiltskin, of course, he had this deal with the miller's daughter and taught her to spin a straw to gold. And therefore, he was supposed to get her firstborn child. Obviously, she wasn't happy about this deal, and there was only one way to defeat him, which was knowing his name. Rather unwisely, he had this habit of dancing around a campfire and singing his own name. This is another example, not from the literature, but from our daily experience, which is, I think, very nice. This author says information security is like sun protection in a sense that you always need more than one measure of protection. In sun protection, you can't only have lotion because that doesn't prevent heat stroke. You can't only wear a hat because that doesn't help you when you get a sunburn. So you need more than one, and you can extend this metaphor. This is quite nice. You can say, as an alternative, you can stay offline completely, or you can just lock yourself in your apartment all summer to avoid the sun. And another good source, I think, is this website TV Tropes. A trope is a storytelling device, a situation that everyone can recognize. I think it's something similar to a cliche. And TV Tropes collects all kinds of these cliches. For example, this is something that you will find very, very frequently in TV and movies and books. It's the magical computer. In former centuries, when a plot required something magic, there was maybe a wizard or a witch, and nowadays it's the hacker with this computer. And this is closely related to the trope of Hollywood hacking, which means that hacking always looks way more exciting in movies than it actually looks when you look at it in real life, because all these beeps and blinking letters and numbers are missing usually. And when you go to TV Tropes and look at any one trope, then you will find on the bottom of the page this list of examples. They really list dozens and hundreds of examples for every trope from movies, TVs, books, etc., sometimes even from real life. So you can really spend hours, and I did in preparation of this talk. You will not only find tropes that are related to plots, but also tropes related to characters. Sometimes you really recognize some constellations that you will have seen in your working life. For example, there are users that always apologize a lot, this, I think, comes with the state of mind that is afraid to try things out to solve problems on their own. Some users regard this computer as a black box, and they think if they press the wrong button, the thing will explode or something. And this is related, I think, to the "you didn't ask" trope, which is when something really goes wrong. Many users are afraid to talk about it. They are afraid to get punished, and I think in reality this is one of the greatest problems you have in organizations with regard to information security, because you can hardly reconstruct how an incident has happened, because many of the users are so afraid to talk about possible mistakes they may have made. Yeah, and finally, this is another frequent trope from movies, the race against the clock. And in order to avoid this, I will terminate this talk now and invite you for a bit of discussion afterwards.